you all for coming out. It's very gratifying to see sold out next to your seminar, you know, weeks and weeks in advance. And the reason for that is sitting right next to me.
Peychaud.
And of course the brands that are sponsoring us, which I'll get to in a second. But it's a great honor to work with Jeff Beachbone Barry, if you can call this work. We did our first seminar in 2009 in Washington, D.C., commemorating the 100th anniversary of when the daiquiri was brought to Washington, D.C. to the Army-Navy Club. But it's always a lot of fun to work with him. And please visit him at Latitude 29, just down the street on Bienville? On Decatur, no, Decatur?
It's on Decatur.
On Decatur. Amazing restaurant, tiki, drinks. But Jeff has written any number of books on all things tiki, and he drills down and finds the precise recipes, and that's part of what we'll be talking about today. And then a couple years later, he'll write another book correcting what he wrote the first time. No, I'm kidding. No, it's really an honor to be here, and we're going to have a lot of fun giving you some practical advice on cocktail history research, as well as tell a few war stories. And if you want to do the whole social media thing, these are some of the tags that we're encouraged to give you. So take a photo of that and tweet away as you will. I want to thank our sponsors today. Sazerac Company is offering Buffalo Trace Bourbon and Peychaud's Aperitivo and Peychaud's Bitters. And of course, Peychaud's Bitters, sort of the girl that brought me to the dance, invented by my cousin Antoine back in the 1850s. Also, House Alpens is offering us Dolan Rouge and Dolan Dry Vermouth, amazing products. And Cognac Ferrand, Pierre Ferrand, and Plantation Rum, and we're honored to have Alexandre Gabriel and Guillaume Lamy with Plantation and Ferrand today. We're using their dry curacao and their OFTD, old-fashioned dark rum today. So in the Jungle Bird. So where might you find an undiscovered cocktail? That's what we'll be talking about today. Finding a drink that you might not have ever found, or no one might have ever found, and sort of the gratifying results that come from finding a drink. And there are certainly the usual suspects, places that are the logical places to look for drinks. You know, buying old menus online on eBay or things like that, acquiring old cocktail books and going through them. You know, there's so many drinks found within the pages of these old menus and drinks, and if you do a little scratching under the surface, you can find some gems and find the stories behind them. And of course, a lot of these books contain folklore and stuff that you really can't put a lot of faith into, but if you can get the recipes and sort of carbon date them to a particular period of time, see what people were drinking back in the 1930s and 40s and earlier. If I can teach you anything, it's to discover this website. Many of you probably know it, but this is an amazing website, EUVS-vintage-cocktail books. This is a phenomenal website. You have full text reproductions of vintage cocktail books going back to 1862. You know, the Jerry Thomas, Bon Vivant's Companion. You can go page by page looking at what barflies and cocktails look like in 1927, or Harry's ABCs of cocktails in 1930, or the Savoy book in 1930. Yeah, you can buy the book online, you know, or a reprint and hope that it's accurate, or you can see them here, and it's pretty amazing. Also, check out archive.org. A really good website. The Wayback Machine is cool because you can see what websites look like back in the late 90s and the last decade. But you can also find a lot of full-text books that are out of copyright using archive.org. And then, of course, there are newspapers. Chronicling America, there's a Library of Congress website. It only goes up to 1924, unfortunately, but when I wrote my Manhattan book, I found a ton of great old newspaper articles about the New York cocktail scene, for example, and the cocktail scene around the world. And also FultonHistory.com, another great free online newspaper source. And there are plenty of subscription newspaper sources out there. So these are the free ones. But anyway, let me talk about a drink that I didn't discover this, obviously, but I discovered an alternative recipe for it. When I was writing To Have and Have Another, a Hemingway cocktail companion, thank you, there's a scene in chapter 5 of that book. At 5 o'clock, I was at the Hotel Crillon waiting for Brett. She was not there, so I sat down and wrote some letters. This is from The Sun Also Rises, the story of Paris and Pamplona. They were not very good letters, but I hope their being on Crillon stationery would help them. Brett did not turn up, so about 5:45 I went down to the bar and had a Jack Rose with George the barman. So obviously in my book, I'm writing about Hemingway's favorite drinks. I want to present a good recipe for the Jack Rose. And most of you know the Jack Rose is a very simple, sour cocktail. Applejack or apple brandy, or you could use Calvados. Little lime juice or lemon juice and a little grenadine for sweetener, and that's the Jack Rose. Pretty simple. I was fortunate enough to be reviewing the book Barflies and Cocktails. Okay, so yeah, you can go back and look at, like, the Savoy cocktail book from 1930 gives you the basic recipe over on the right. Lemon or lime, grenadine, or Applejack or Calvados. And you can see some of the old cocktail menus back in the day where they're giving you the basic recipe. But what were they drinking in Paris? Because that's where the story takes place. So I was fortunate enough to be able to scratch under the surface and discover that in Paris, and I've found several recipes, they were making a very complicated Jack Rose that's actually the Jack Rose. We're going to have this again, aren't we?
They love the Jack Rose.
It's basically the Jack Rose and the Bronx cocktail kind of crammed together. I mean, look at this drink. You've got the components of a regular Jack Rose, Applejack, the citrus, lemon and lime juice, and grenadine, but you've got gin, French vermouth, Italian vermouth, and orange juice, which is the Bronx, all crammed together. And I first thought, this looks really nasty. I don't know if I want to put that in my book. It's actually a delicious drink, and it's not too terribly different from, it's a little drier, it's got a little more backbone because of the gin. It's a delicious drink. So this is what it looks like in Barflies and Cocktails. It was invented at Harry's New York. This is the way they were making it at Harry's New York bar, and I'm proud to say they have my book behind the bar there. So, this is from a book from 1927 called 370 Recettes de Cocktails. That's Jean, can you help me, Alexander, pronounce his last name? Okay, thank you. I think he's giving Beach Bum a run for his money in that photo. I don't know, and certainly the cover of the book. But so he's using vermouth, sweet and dry. He's using Calvados gin. He's making it the same way. And here we are, a cocktail book printed in Rome, but in French. The same thing: orange juice, gin, and both vermouths. So this is how they were making it over there, and if I'm writing about the Jack Rose and The Sun Also Rises, this is how I want to present it. So anyway, now that's not anything that anybody couldn't have found, because those cocktail books are out there. This is a story of a drink that I'm pretty certain I discovered, and if it weren't for my writing this Hemingway book, I don't think anybody would have discovered it. That's Hemingway on the right. The fellow in the middle, not the marlin, but the human, that's Joe Russell. Anybody know who Joe Russell was? Anybody? He was the owner of Sloppy Joe's in Key West, and that's his son on the left. But he and Hemingway became great buddies in the 1930s, late 20s, and 1930s. And of course, Prohibition is taking place at this time, and he was a rum runner. He would take his boat, the Anita, and take it across, there's the Anita, take it across the Straits of Florida, 90 miles in that rickety old boat that eventually was taking on water because of all the marlins that were ramming it. But there they are with a big marlin that they caught. But they would run back and forth between Key West and Cuba, and brandy and everything else. So Hemingway kept meticulous fishing logs when he was out fishing, either on the Anita or when he bought his boat, the Pilar, in 1934. He kept records. And there they are again. That's Hemingway on the left, Carlos Gutierrez, Joe Russell, and the fellow on the right is a guy named Joe Lowe. He was the basis for one of the characters in To Have and Have Not, a rummy named Eddie. But he was killed in the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 that swept through the Middle Keys, sadly. So anyway, looking at one of these old fishing records, fishing logs, my eyes fall upon the word cocktail. And it says 3 jiggers rum, 1 bottle cider, lime, sugar, and who can tell me what that final word is? I have an idea. At first I thought it was 2 siphons, but it's 2 different Hemingway handwriting experts have convinced me that it's 2 spoons, so 2 spoons of sugar. So I made this drink and I named it the Josie Russell. That was Hemingway's nickname for his friend Joe Russell. And it's kind of cool to, you know, to see this on cocktail menus around the country. And it's a nice little drink. You know, you can use dark rum, light rum. You can use hard cider or regular cider that you feed your kids. Of course, you might feed your kids hard cider too. I don't know. I'm not judging. But this is really a nice drink. And, you know, I just stumbled upon it by looking at fishing logs on microfilm in the Hemingway Library in Boston in the summer of 2011. So, and I also found on this one page, after Joe Russell died during surgery in Havana, he was just having minor surgery and he had a heart attack and died. All Hemingway wrote that day was Mr. Josie died, which is kind of poignant. And there's Joe Russell there on the left. There's Joe Russell on the left and Charles Thompson feeding rum or whiskey to a fish head, which is very, very kind of them. I don't think it'll revive him. This is not a corpse reviver number 2. So, all right. Now the drink that you're now enjoying, I hope, was also found while researching the Hemingway book, and this is not a drink that. This is only a discovery by name because there are plenty of vermouth cocktails out there that are mixtures of sweet and dry vermouth. The Old Hickory comes to mind, allegedly consumed by Andrew Jackson here in New Orleans prior to the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1814, 1815. Not bloody likely because vermouth hadn't arrived in New Orleans until the 1840s, but whatever. But this is a really nice drink, and it shows up in an article that Hemingway wrote in 1935 for Esquire. He helped launch Esquire magazine, and the money that he used, that he was paid, he said to the editor, the publisher, he said, just give me $7,000 or $8,000 and I'll write a bunch of articles for you over the next few years. And he used the money to help pay for the boat, but the Pilar. But here's a story where he's writing about fishing out on the Gulf Stream, and they're getting ready for dinner, and he says, let's have vermouth then. Tell Bolo to bring out the bottles. We had the tall glasses with mixed French and Italian vermouth, 2 parts of French to 1 part Italian, with a dash of bitters and a lemon peel. Fill the glass with ice, stir and serve. And then all of a sudden a whale broached the surface, and they went on this wild goose chase to try to catch the whale. It's like something out of Moby Dick. But so word had gotten around in the library that guy over there in that carrel with all the microfiche or whatever, he wasn't just your average academic writing about some dry subject, no pun intended. He's writing a cocktail book. So this one researcher came up to me and said, you're the guy writing the cocktail book, right? And I'm like, yeah. She goes, we found this in his medical records. Don't ask me what it was doing in there, but this is in Hemingway's medical records. Well, in the late 1950s, after surviving 2 plane crashes and suffering from hypertension and diabetes, Hemingway's doctor said, you can only have 1 cocktail a day, plus maybe a liter of wine. So I speculate, my hypothesis is that this drink was a drink that Hemingway had created and shown his doctor, hey, this is the drink I'm having, the 1 drink a day. So it's pretty detailed. You fill it up, it's like 2 fingers of whiskey, and he spells it without the E, so you're thinking it's Scotch, I don't know. Fill it up to here with Jerez, sherry, or manzanilla. He loves sherry all the time he spent in Spain. And then fill the rest of the glass up with champagne, and I guess the rest of the glass is for ice. So I called this drink the Physician Heal Thyself. And I've actually had better names suggested to me, like the Papa Doc, but so I've seen this on cocktail menus around the country, and it's just kind of cool to think, but for this researcher handing me this sheet of paper with a cocktail diagram on it, it would not see the light of day. All right, so the second book I did is on the Manhattan, and much of my research was spent in the old newspaper archives. I used that chronicling America and a number of other newspapers. So you're seeing like the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from the 1920s and 30s, and you're seeing the New York Sun and the New York Tribune from the 1880s, 1890s. You're seeing all these great old stories about the cocktail scene. And you know how often today you see articles, of course we have blogs and endless numbers of online magazines, but even in the print media, you find, a lot of cocktail writing being done, and bartenders are becoming rock stars. And that was the way it was back in the 1880s, 1890s, leading up to Prohibition. Just on and on, you had these stories being written about the great watering holes, the great drinking palaces, and one of them was the Manhattan Club. And this is from a Cleveland Plain Dealer. The original story appeared in the New York Sun, but this was syndicated, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer talking about the Grand Manhattan Club in New York City. And it's a huge article. It's like a full-page article. But way down at the bottom, it says, the advantages of the Manhattan Club are many. The best whiskey is sold there at 10 cents a glass. It is the best in the market, and even at 10 cents a glass, there is a profit to the club. Cigars are sold at 10% over cost, blah, 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 blah. The first recipe for the Brooklyn actually used sweet vermouth, and I think it's a better drink. Jack Gruhusko, what's his name? He had a Jack's Guide to Drinks in like 1908 or something like that. The Plimpton, Plantation Guadalupe rum, Dolan Rouge, Angostura bitters, basically a rum Manhattan, delicious drink. The Queen Anne, you use Pierre Ferrand, cognac, dry vermouth, orange bitters, maraschino liqueur. These are just great drinks, and I had more fun like picking apart this newspaper article and using most of the Manhattan variations that I found. The Smithtown, Sazerac rye whiskey, Dolan Rouge, fresh lemon juice, and orange bitters. Again, just tremendous drinks. The Star cocktail, Applejack or apple brandy or Calvados, Dolan Rouge, cherry hearing, yellow chartreuse, and Peychaud's bitters. So had a lot of fun with these. This is a drink that I also found. This is from a 1904 New York Times, the failing New York Times, as someone might call it. Sad. Anyway, just thinking about him, I'm going to have a drink. Spring fashions and drinks. Just as new clothes come into vogue, so do strange beverages appear in the cafes of New York. So you look around in here, there's a drink called the Sakosuma cocktail. Another one new to Broadway is known as the Sakosuma cocktail and is made of Applejack, vermouth, and a dash of Angostura bitters. Another great drink, really good drink. So get out there, and you don't even get newsprint on your fingers because they're online. Just look at the old newspapers. This was, somebody emailed me this. We love your book about the Manhattan, and my favorite drink. I saw the Sakosuma cocktail, made the connection to the former Bryant Distillery in Sakosuna, New Jersey. This structure was renovated by my grandparents, an important part of my memory. So it was kind of cool to have somebody reach out to me. I've since had to get a restraining order, but this is the old Morristown Township Public Library. They sent me a picture of it. So this is near Sakosuna. Okay, so from my latest book, and I'm going to yield the floor in a few minutes. These two characters are Harry and Caresse Crosby. They were notorious. They lived in Paris. They led a very decadent lifestyle. They would entertain in bed or in their bathtub. Drank like fish, had orgies. They had two whippets, two dogs. One was named Narcisse Noir, and the other one was named Clitoris. Sorry. Every year, the arts community, all the students in the Parisian arts community would have something called the Quats Arts Ball. And it was like just a decadent, display, and people would wear next to nothing. And one year, she was basically nude, and he was wearing just a loincloth with a necklace made of dead pigeons around his neck, and painted red. So the ironic thing about her attire or lack thereof that evening, she held a patent. She invented a brassiere. So go figure that out. That night she chose not to wear it. So he was a poet, and they had a publishing house, and they actually published a lot of amazing authors, James Joyce and Hemingway and a number of others. So they did have quite a contribution, not just to the decadent part of Parisian society. So I'm reading her memoirs recently because I'm writing my next book is about the drinks scene of Paris in the 1920s, you know, Hemingway and Fitzgerald and that whole crowd, Picasso and James Joyce. So I'm reading her diaries, which are quite eye-opening, but they're not as salacious as you would think. When we wanted to be entertained, we received in bed. We always drank champagne, and we almost always begin with caviar. Our guests were invited to take baths if they wanted to, for we had a sunken marble tub and a black and white tile bathroom that boasted a white bearskin rug and an open fireplace, as well as a cushioned chaise lounge covered in rose-red toweling. We liked to experiment in bath oils and bath salts. There was a great quantity of them to play with, and most of our friends lived in Latin Quarter rooms, where the plumbing was kept a dark secret. Chez nous martinis, so like homemade martinis? Yeah, homemade martinis and rose geranium mingled in libation. So, you know, my ears perk up, and I've actually found some rose geranium essential oils that are ingestible, and also a rose geranium liqueur made out in Portland, I think. And that this recipe will be in my next book. You know, something that I just happen to find in the memoirs of Caress Crosby. Caress. Her name was Polly, and she changed it to Caress. Yeah, it's just to reiterate, it's a lot of fun. This whole game of cocktail history, and you can find some pretty cool things out there. And I wish you good hunting. And I'm going to turn the floor over to my friend Jeff Beachbum-Berry, who's now Jeffrey Berry, I think, on Facebook. Facebook made him change.
Yeah, Facebook doesn't want me to be a bum. I'll show you. So this sort of carries on with what Phil was talking about. The Jungle Bird was a weird thing for me. When I did I don't remember whether this was in the first book or the second book, but it would have been around either 98 or 2000 that I found it. Actually, I would have found it even earlier than that, in a 1989 book called Bartender's Guide by John J. Poyster, which at the time, as a complete cocktail geek, hobbyist, pre-internet, when I thought I was the only person in the world who liked this stuff, and you can walk into most used bookstores in LA. They did have used bookstores in LA back then. And there would be like tons of these things, used cocktail books. You can get them for next to nothing. I found Jerry Thomas's guide, the 1930 reprint, for like 50 cents, and Charles Baker's books for nothing, practically, still in their little cardboard case. But they had no value back then. I mean, nobody was into this stuff. So one of the books I found was a rather new one, Bartender's Guide, 1989, but I bought any bartender's guide I could find because I was sifting them all for tiki drinks, what we now call tiki drinks, what back then we called exotic cocktails. And very often you'd get like a 600-page book like this one, like the Bartender's Guide, and there'd be like maybe 3 or 4 recipes, and maybe one would be kind of okay, but that's kind of like the panning for gold thing that you were doing back then. And in this case, the one recipe that was kind of okay was the Jungle Bird. And I wasn't going to put it into the book because I didn't really care for it that much. I mean, it was like 4 ounces of pineapple juice, dark rum, they didn't specify what kind, a little bit of lime, and a little Campari. Well, the reason I put it in was, it was a squeaker. It was really a squeaker, and I didn't really care for it, but I needed recipes for this booklet. I didn't have a whole lot of them. And I was like, all right, I'm going to put it in. The only reason I ended up putting it in was it came from the Kuala Lumpur Hilton in Malaysia. And I thought, Malaysia, that's cool. I don't have any drinks from Malaysia, so I'll stick it in there. So flash forward, 10, 15 years later, and it's the only drink out of all my books that's being served in bars during the cocktail renaissance. And I'm convinced it's because there's a half an ounce of Campari in it. Campari was like the gateway for craft cocktail bartenders who at the time wouldn't touch tiki with a 10-foot pole or with a 1-foot Gaz Reagan finger. But there was Campari in it, there was an Amaro, so okay, we can deal with this. And And so it's become like one of the most famous drinks that I found, and wasn't that hard to find. I found it the same way Phil found a lot of drinks, just like looking through old books.
You know where I discovered this drink? Had it for the first time in Stockholm, Sweden. Yeah,
the bird flies around, yeah.
About 3 years ago.
But that was an easy one. What we're really here to talk about, what Phil and I are really here to talk about, and why I was happy Phil invited me, because Phil's one of the good ones. Phil's one of the few people who does what we call primary research. Doesn't just go on the internet and look up Wikipedia and find other things that other people have said about things, and he doesn't copy misinformation. He goes to, I mean, it blew my mind when he was talking about going to the library, Kennedy Library, looking through the archives, finding a sketch Hemingway wrote while he was probably not paying attention in a doctor's office. You know, it was probably, my theory on that drink, on the physician heal myself, is this doctor was giving him a lecture and telling him what he needed to eat and when he needed to take his pills, and Hemingway was going, and copying it all out, and he was really just drawing that drink. But how cool is that to find that, that's primary research. That was a true lost drink. The Josie Russell, truly a lost drink. I mean, there's no way to find that. Nobody published it anywhere. No newspaper archive online is going to have that. You have to go out and you have to look for it. There's a lot of recipes. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of recipes in the last 300 years that have never been published. Many published recipes aren't good because they're incomplete. A lot of times they're simplified by book editors or magazine editors or by liquor companies because they don't want anything too complicated for their readers. So if you do happen to find a rare recipe for something, it's probably not, chances are it's altered. It's the Reader's Digest condensed version, if you will. I ran into an elderly lady at a tasting I did in Beverly Hills many years ago of tiki drinks, and she pulled me aside and said, "Young man," my hair was actually not gray back then. "Young man, I knew Trader Vic." I said, "You did, yeah." And he told me, you always leave something out. Like every recipe he published, you always leave something out because you don't want people to make the drink at home and say, "This is just as good as it is at the restaurant. I'm not going to go pay $14 for it and Valet Park and order dinner. I'm just going to make it here." So that happens as well. Also, many published recipes are deliberately misleading. What the few recipes that Don the Beachcomber, who we'll talk about in a moment, actually did deign to publish are wrong. He published them to throw his competitors off the scent. These recipes were top secret industrial, you needed industrial espionage to get them because you could make a fortune selling them. What you do if you do that is you're taking market share away from Don the Beachcomber. He doesn't want you to have these recipes. The last thing he's going to do is publish them. And the second to the last thing he's going to do is publish them correct so that you can just make them in your bar and steal his customer base. The ones I found were, again, in used bookstores in spiral-bound charity cookbooks. You guys all seen those when you've been browsing around? They're like the little white plastic binding, and it's like the Women's Society of the Waikiki Social Club or whatever.
I have sorry to interrupt, I have an old 1940s New Orleans food and drink spiral-bound book, and the recipe for the Ramos Gin Fizz is classic. It says, add gin and half and half and lime juice and lemon juice and orange flower water, spelled F-L-O-U-R. Orange flower water, shake well, shake until tired, shake again.
That's actually good advice. I mean, there was bad advice in the ones I found for Don. When he was living in Hawaii, the U.S. Navy Women's Auxiliary published one of these things, a charity cookbook, and he gave them a Planter's Punch and a daiquiri, and they're like bear no relation to the recipes I eventually found, which we'll get to now. So, what do you do if you can't find a recipe online? You can't find a recipe in a book. You can't find a recipe in the library looking up old newspapers. You do what they used to call, back in the day when newspapers were actually profitable and the way people got their news, shoe leather.
reporters would routinely refer to shoe leather. You wear out your shoes. If you're not wearing out your shoes, or as they also used to call them, gum shoes, rubber sole, you wore rubber-soled shoes because you wore them out so quickly. You're getting out there and you're talking to people and you're hunting things down the way that you did when you went after, I mean, you talked to Hemingway's relatives, right, and old friends and all that. Shoe leather is the only way sometimes to find these things, and a lot of that, of course, is luck. I mean, I can sit here and tell you, yeah, I found all these lost recipes through shoe leather, but a lot of it's luck. I happen to be in the right place at the right time for once in my life when I went looking for all these old tiki recipes, because I happen to live in Los Angeles, back when snakes walked and dinosaurs ruled the earth in 1980s and 1990s, when a lot of the people who made these drinks during the golden age were still around. They're still serving drinks. In Chinese restaurants, in Mexican restaurants, they were making white wine spritzers, they were making margaritas, but they had the knowledge that this, you know, they'd done that for years. And I was in a place where I could sometimes stumble upon them. So the gentleman on the right, Don the Beachcomber, he kept his recipes from us deliberately. He didn't want anybody to know what they were. Joe Shalom, the guy on the left, who we'll talk about next, I think people just weren't that interested back then. He worked all over the world. He worked in Cairo, he worked in Havana, he worked in San Juan, New York, Paris, Tel Aviv. Yeah, he opened things for, all over the Middle East. And I just think he was too busy to write them down. Some of his recipes were published, but a lot of them weren't. And there was one of his recipes that I was particularly interested in. There are always, on every classic mid-century tiki menu, you're going to find 3 drinks. You're going to find, of course, a zombie, the one up there in the middle, and you're going to find a Mai Tai, and you're going to find a suffering bastard, the one right down there. Now, in the course of going to these places and drinking a lot and doing my little hobby things, I found out that Trader Vic made the Mai Tai. That was no secret. He wanted everybody to know that. He actually went to court to prove that he invented the Mai Tai. The zombie was no secret. That was Don the Beachcomber's signature drink. What was in it was secret, but he made no secret of the fact that that was his drink. But the suffering bastard, there's nothing out there. Who did it? Who was behind it? We don't know. The only thing I knew was what Trader Vic wrote on his menu, because he put a suffering bastard on his menu, and he said, invented by Joe Shalom, misspelled the name, at Shepherd's Hotel Cairo, misspelled that as well. And his suffering bastard was not in any way, shape, or form Joe's suffering bastard. I think he just liked the name. His was a Mai Tai with an extra ounce of rum in it, as I found out later. So I came up snake eyes. I couldn't find anything on this drink and who invented it. I didn't know who Joe Shalom was. I didn't know that anything about him. But finally, when the internet started to happen, or at least when I found out about it, I Googled Joe Shalom, and after about 30 pages into a Google search, I found a death notice. And ironically, I Googled this about a week after he died. It was February 27th, 2004. He died in his 90s. He lived a long, long life. And it said, it was his family put a paid death notice in. He didn't get an obit. Everybody who had forgotten about him. He was once the most famous bartender in the world, as I was to find out. But in 2004, nobody knew who he was. And his family, his wife, his daughter Colette, put this little notice in. He will be sorely missed by his daughter Colette, grandsons Laura and Dylan. So I thought, oh, maybe I can find Colette. So I Googled Colette Shalom. Well, that got me nowhere until finally it penetrated my thick skull. Maybe she got married, and she's no longer Colette Shalom. She's Colette somebody else. And same thing with Lawrence and Dylan. They would have the patriarchal name because that was what happened back then.
Which one is you?
Well, the guy in the hat, of course. So what happened in the course of a year, I Googled Colette Shalom, found nothing, tried it again a few months later, found nothing, tried it again a few months later. Persistence and or having nothing better to do with your life are two really good things when you're looking for lost recipes. And we're like 30 pages into a Google search. I mean, it just took forever. I found a little thing about Colette Shalom. It said Colette Shalom has just been as accepted at the Prospect of Whitby. Prospect of Whitby sounds like a pub. So, of course, I start Googling Prospect of Whitby. And yeah, 1 million pubs come up. But then finally, what comes up is that was the name of a sorority at Cornell University. So I called up Cornell University, the alumni roles, and said, Alumni Association, and said, I know this is not cool, and you can say no to me, it's fine, but would you be willing to forward a letter to me from Colette Shalom, who may or may not have attended Cornell in the 1950s, because that's when the thing was dated, and if you could do that, I would be most grateful. She said, fine, so she did it. Nothing happens, and then 6 months after that, I get an email saying, what took you so long? So it's like I was trying to get my dad to write a book about his life for years, and it never happened. And Egyptian historians, because Joe spent most of his career in Cairo, came up to his door and wanted him to write a book, and he said, nah, I'm retired now. So she starts talking about her dad. I'm on the phone, in the living room, and I've got a little pad and a pencil, and I start writing down all the stuff she's telling me about how he invented the suffering bastard during the Second World War when the Nazis were like right outside of Cairo, and the drink was a hangover cure for the 11th Hussars who drank it during the Battle of El Alamein, and that's the drink that won the Battle of El Alamein. And she goes on and on and on. She goes, and then during the Suez Crisis, we got kicked out of Egypt because Nasser thought that my dad was a spy because he had so many foreign journalists and generals drinking at his bar, and he was Jewish, so they didn't like that very much. So we got kicked out of Egypt, and then we went to Havana, and we were working at the Havana Hilton, and then Castro took over, and we got kicked out of Havana, and she says, basically we're going from uprising to uprising, and finally we ended up at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and she's telling me this stuff, and I'm trying to write it out, and I say, her name was Colette Shalom Roy. I said, Miss Roy, where do you live? And she goes, I'm in Manhattan. Can I come up and visit you with a tape recorder? Because I can't read this fast. And I did, and I took a scanner with me on the plane, and I rolled it in a suitcase all the way up through Midtown Manhattan to get to the showroom where she was selling Persian rugs in Midtown. And I sat her down, and she had her father's archives. With not only all of these amazing newspaper stories that were just not online, but also his recipes, his lost recipes. Over 30 of them, she let me scan them right there in the office as she was barking orders in Italian, French, and Spanish to her international crew. And I was just like, palpitating because I finally saw recipes to all these drinks I'd only seen on menus or didn't know about at all.
Did you have a cigarette afterwards?
I couldn't get it to my lips. So that's one example of, they're out there, but you have to look, you have to go out there and put on your shoes and talk to people. It's really the only way you're going to find some of these things. And that's also what happened. And again, and I apologize, it's easy for me to say that if you're in the right place at the right time. But you can do what Phil did. Phil wasn't in the right place at the right time. He didn't know, he wasn't fishing for marlins with Hemingway, and he wasn't hanging out in Cuban bars 20 years after Hemingway's gone so that the bartenders who knew him could talk. He went out and he sought it. He went to the library and he dug. And then he saw names, and he contacted those people's names, and
Well, it's the old expression, luck is the residue of hard work. I'm doing the hard work, and the luck comes in where this researcher says, check this out, this diagram.
Phil, please don't say hard work. Please don't say that word.
Says the bum.
It's the residue of hobbyism in design. Let's say that. It's our hobby, our very physically damaging hobby. So. Don the Beachcomber was the originator of what we now call the tiki drink, and he invented the tiki bar back in 1934 with his place Don the Beachcombers in Hollywood, a whole new style of drinking for the United States, what he called rum rhapsodies, what were later called in the trade exotic cocktails, and what we now call tiki drinks. And this is one of the many menus that I would find at swap meets or paper shows or sometimes in thrift stores back in the 90s. Now, of course, you just go to eBay. It's a lot easier. And I would look at these drinks and go, what is in these drinks? Because nothing was published. I didn't know what was in a Navy grog, a Cobra's Fang, a QB Cooler, a rum julep. I had no idea, and there was nothing out there. I was scouring all those bookstores and getting like zilch. It was the same thing. Just happened to meet people. Around 1991, after I'd been interested in this stuff for a few years, I met a lady named Anine, who was a music journalist, and I fell in love at first sight. And yes, I'm here to tell you that is a thing. It happens. Happened to me. 5 months after I met her, she finally agreed to go out with me. And shortly after that, she took me to a cocktail party in the Silver Lake area where I met a guy named Charles Schneider. Charles Schneider was an actor who said, "Oh, you like tiki stuff? You should meet my friend Sven Kirsten." Sven Kirsten was a cinematographer who had shot a movie that Charles Schneider was in, who also really liked tiki stuff. So I met Sven. Through Sven, I met this guy who called himself Otto von Stroheim, who was a graphic designer in Venice and a surfer. By the way, he didn't even know that he had named himself after that famous film director, for all of you film buffs who know who that is. I said, "Otto, it's really cool you named yourself after the guy who did The Wedding March." He goes, "What?" I don't know where he found the name. But anyway, Otto was a really nice guy, and he was really into tiki, and he was a lot more type A than any of us, and he put out this little newsletter called Tiki News. And 5 years after he did that, he transferred all of this. It was a little handmade zine, but he put it online once that became a thing. And shortly after that, he got an email from a lady named Jennifer Santiago, who lived in Richmond, Virginia. And she said, "Oh, yeah, my dad, he was the maitre d' at Don the Beachcombers in the 1930s, and he used to drive Ava Gardner home after she had one too many, and he used to do this and used to do that. And he has, he passed away a long time ago, but he has this like little black book of Don the Beachcomber recipes. Would you be interested in that?"
Another cigarette.
And Otto said, "Yeah, I think we would be interested in that." And so I got a Xerox. Shortly thereafter, she sent me a Xerox copy of the little black book. That's one page right there. And finally, there's the zombie. There's the mystery of the zombie. After many, many years wondering what was in it. The problem was the recipes were in code. In the 1940s, so many bartenders had stolen Don's drinks who worked at Don's. They were paid a little bit more money to go work somewhere else and take the recipes with them. And this is how Don's recipes spread, sort of like Johnny Pineapple Seed, across the country. There were 150 copycats by 1937, which is just a few years after he opened. And Don would fight that any way he could. He filed lawsuits. He filed copyright violation lawsuits to various places. One place called itself Monty Proser's Beachcomber in New York. There's a whole chain of those. Sued that guy. Monty Proser would tell people at his place that not only was he the home of the zombie, Don's signature drink, which he had stolen, but as people were leaving his restaurant, he would say, "Oh, when you're out in Hollywood, go visit our place over there, and say hello to Don and Sonny." So he was asking for it, and he got sued. But hundreds of places like that would hire away Don's staff and get the recipes. So he put his recipes in code. So if you're a new hire, so if I hire Guillaume to work behind the bar at Don the Beachcomber, I don't know who he is, I don't trust him, he doesn't look very trustworthy, but I need, I need people. So Guillaume gets behind the bar, and he's told how to make the drinks. He says, yeah, the bottles are labeled Munroloff, Marchesa, Don's Mix, Don's Dashes. A bottle will have, the only thing on the label will be number 2, number 4, number 6. And that's the recipe he knows. And if Alexander is going to open up a tiki bar in Paris to do battle with Dirty Dick, right? And say, I can do better than that, and I'm going to steal away Guillaume, I'm going to pay him $15 more a week, and he's going to give me the recipes. And Guillaume says, $15 and I can live in Paris, okay. So he goes, he gets behind the bar, and he says, boss, where's your bottle of Munroloff? Where's your number 2? Where's number 4? And this actually worked. It worked really well, and it stopped the diaspora of Don's recipes. It also effectively ruined anybody's chances in the 21st century of finding out what his recipes were, at least temporarily. So the code I was looking at recipes, they were in the code, it was incredibly frustrating. Things like syrup parisienne, I had no idea what that could be. Grenadine, maybe? Something French? Marquesa, is that like a misspelling of the Marquesas? What fruits are native to the Marquesas? Maybe that's what the syrup is. Munroloff, that turned out to be not that hard. I went to a bar called the Tiki Tea in Hollywood, which was kind of my local, and I asked Mike Bowen there, whose dad had worked at Don the Beachcombers in the 30s, said, Mike, what do you know about Munroloff? He laughed at me, and then he said, well, you hold it up to a mirror. So Munroloff was falernum spelled backwards. So some of these things you could crack. So one drink in particular, I'll just talk you through one drink and tell you how the code was broken. This took 2 years. This is a drink called the Nui Nui. Again, it was one of Don's originals that made its way around the country. Everybody had one on the menu, including rival chains like the Kontiki, which was in a Sheraton hotels around the world. This was the recipe in Dick Santiago's notebook. 1/2 lime, 1/2 orange, 1/4 ounce of number 2, 1/4 ounce of number 4, 2 St. Croix, and a dash of number 8. Okay. What the hell am I supposed to do with that? Completely skunked. This is kind of what my dreams looked like for many, many months after that. And then, again, through just meeting people, one thing leading to another, Otto gets another email from a lady named Julie Reese. Julie Reese is the daughter of Kathy Riddle, who was the wife of Hank Riddle, deceased, who was a bar manager at Don the Beachcombers in Palm Springs from the 1950s to the 1970s. And she has her husband's notebook of drinks. There it is right there. That's the title page. Kathy herself did the little decorations. And long story short, I get a hold of this. And this has broken down some of the code key. By the 1970s, just to make life easier for his bartenders, he told what Don's dashes were, number 1 through 8, and there was a key. So finally, I could unlock the Nui Nui and make one. It turns out that number 2 was Pernod, number 4 was Grenadine, and number 8 was plain old Angostura bitters. So I made the drink, and I was very excited, and I blended it and held it to my lips, and it was the worst fucking drink I've ever had in my life. It was just terrible. And I thought, this is what he was keeping a secret? If I had 150 people copying me, I'd give them this recipe. They'd go out of business in 6 months. This can't be right. So I was very depressed. Suffice to say, I didn't make another one. And then about 6 months after that, no, not 6 months, I'm getting ahead of myself. The day after that, I was depressed, so I went to my local. I went to the Tiki Tea, and there's Mike Bowen on the right, who I told you about. That's his dad, Ray, who was one of Don's original bartenders. And the only reason I found the Tiki Tea was because of a girl I went out in college named Kathy Seib. The day that we turned old enough to drink, we went to the Tiki Tea, which she knew about because she lived near there. That's how I met Ray Bowen when he was still alive, and I actually got some stuff out of him when he was alive. And then I was talking to his son. I always sat right next to the blender right there to see if I can lean over and see how they're doing stuff. But their bottles have no labels at all. The Tiki Tea, if you go there and you look at their bottles of syrups, mixers, there's nothing on the label. They're just going by color. So anyway, I told my tale of woe to Mike Bowen. I thought at the very least he'd get a laugh out of it. And I told him about the crappy Nui Nui. And he goes, well, there weren't just Don's dashes. There were also Don's spices. Maybe number 2 and number 4 were Don's spices, number 2 and number 4. I said, yeah? What can you tell me? He goes, well, my dad used to go to this place called the Astra Flavors Company out in Inglewood near the airport in the 60s, and he'd get bottles of number 2 and number 4. And he'd order it, and then these guys in white coats would go up to this big dispensary, they'd stick a bottle under there, it'd come out, they'd slap the label on it, Astra Flavors number 2 and number 4. And at this time I was on the edge of my stool. He was like, Mike, what did number 2 and number 4 taste like? And he goes, I don't know, I was 8 years old at the time.
Who does number 2 work for?
Right. So now the code is cracked, but it's still useless. We can't drink it. But perhaps that 1/4 ounce of number 2 is Astra Flavors number 2, Astra Flavors number 4. Then 6 months later, I meet a guy named Bob Ismino through tiki carver named Bamboo Ben. Somebody writes an article about Bamboo Ben in the Huntington Beach Register or something like that. And this old retired guy, 78 years old, Bob Asmino, sees it, and he writes a letter, an actual physical letter, they were still doing that, to Bamboo Ben, care of the newspaper, and says, hey, you might be interested in my stories. I used to work at the Kon-Tiki Sheraton in Cleveland and in Portland and in Chicago. And it's like, it's really cool that you're bringing back this lost art of tiki carving, blah, blah, blah. And then Bamboo Ben forwarded the letter to me, and I interviewed Bob Asmino, because at the time I was writing about this nonsense, and I would really want to talk to somebody who actually was there in the moment in the 1960s during all this. So it occurred to me, after talking to him for a while, hey, Bob, did you guys ever use Spices No. 2 or Spices No. 4 at the Kon-Tiki? And he goes, oh yeah, Bob Lancaster, sure, I remember that. And I said, what's No. 4? And he goes, that's a cinnamon syrup. It's like, okay, what's No. 2? And he goes, well, just use spiced rum instead of the rum in the drink and you'll be fine. And that disturbed the purist in me, so I wanted to crack No. 2, so I went home and I bought a bunch of spiced rums, which at the time all were very nautical. There was Sailor Jerry, Captain Morgan, Ensign Pulver, all these different things. And they all had one thing in common. They all reeked of artificial vanilla. And then came cinnamon, and then came allspice. So I thought, well, if No. 2 is in the same drink with No. 4, and if No. 4 is cinnamon, I'm going to leave cinnamon out of the No. 2, and then you're left with vanilla and allspice. So that's what I did. And finally made the drink. And it was really good. Now, I have no idea if what I decoded for No. 2 is correct, but it's got to be in the ballpark, and I got No. 4 right from the tiki horse's mouth, Bob. So that was that, and that took 2 years. We're not serving samples. I think the last sample we got was the Jungle Bird, which is, Caps, I salute you, that was a really good Jungle Bird, better than the one in my book. But you can always walk up the street 2 blocks and order one at latitude 29.
But you make it differently, right?
We don't do that.
No, oh, that's right.
What would make you think that we do it, that we would leave something out of the published recipe? Anyway, so this is, again, right place, right time. Los Angeles, 1990s, and then eventually Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in the early 2000s, when I was introduced to this guy, Ron Liquidine, who is the son of Mariano Liquidine, who was the head bartender at the Mai Kai restaurant in Fort Lauderdale since it opened in 1956, and he gave me some recipes. And this guy, Tony Ramos, I went to reluctantly, sometime in the 1990s, went to a Chinese restaurant called Madame Wu's on the west side. Mo, you remember Madame Wu's, right? And I didn't really want to go there, but we were meeting clients who wanted to go have Chinese food, and we thought, oh, this is a past its prime Chinese place. Let's go get Szechuan or Hunan. What are we getting Cantonese food for? So we're early, and Ian and I were early, and we sit down at the bar, and we get a bar menu, which was very unusual at the time to actually have one of those. And the menu is Don the Beachcomber's greatest hits. It's all his drinks. And I said to the guy, who was that guy, excuse me, sir, did you ever work at Don the Beachcomber? He goes, oh, yeah. Yeah, and he told me how he used to serve Navy grogs to Frank Sinatra and all this other amazing stuff. And suffice it to say, Sven, Kirsten, Otto, myself, and everyone else in our circle became regulars there. We even brought in a boombox so we could play Martin Denny in the bar while we were drinking. And Madame Wu herself didn't, Madame Wu, who was a really cool lady, she was pushing 90 at the time, and she wore these like Jackie O sunglasses and these really cool Susie Wong tunics, and she didn't care. She was just happy somebody was in the bar, which was always deserted until we discovered Tony. So Tony eventually gave me a couple of recipes after over-tipping for about 2 solid years. If you're in Whittier, go visit these guys, Bob and Leroy at a tiki outfit called Oceanic Arts. They supplied all the interior decor for the tiki places all the way from the 1950s to today. They're still at it. And they have a really interesting file cabinet, which Bob has the lock to, which has a lot of old recipes in it. So that's basically the thing. Just get out there and drink. Go to bars and drink and talk and ask questions and wear out the shoes. And maybe you'll get lucky. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo. All right, the last drink we're going to talk about is sort of a twist on the whole Dusty Archives theme. How many of you have been to the Seelbach Hotel in Louisville? Famous old, venerable hotel, and possessing of a time-honored cocktail story. How many of you know where I'm going? Yeah, okay. No plot spoilers, please. Anyway, so here's the Seelbach, and what I love about these vintage postcards, you can pull out your phone right now and look for a vintage postcard of the Monteleone, for example. They always show this broad avenue in front of it with like 4 cars wide, you know, like Royal Street is Canal Street or something. So they're never consistent with reality, but this is a cool old vintage postcard from the Seelbach. And as the story goes, and those are the words we use so often in the cocktail world, the Seelbach was named for the Seelbach Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky, where it was born in 1917. That it can be published here is a testament to the diplomatic skills of cocktail scribes Gary and the late Marty Regan. This is from our friend Ted Haigh's excellent book, Vintage Spirits and Forgotten Cocktails, which was sort of what gave me the idea of this seminar in the first place. You know, Ted, one of the early pioneers, along with Bum, of digging into the history of old drinks. The restaurant director for the hotel discovered the recipe, last served before Prohibition, and subsequently lost in 1995. The director, Adam Seeger, set about to produce it again, albeit with key ingredients kept secret. The Regans urged divulging the recipe, hinting at cocktail immortality in one of their fine drink books, and finally Seeger submitted, requiring only that the formula be kept secret until the book's publication. That book, New Classic Cocktails, was published in 1997. And although the Seelbach has been a matter of public record since then, I believe Vintage Spirits and Forgotten Cocktails is the second book to set it to print. After all, that is what this book is all about.
He was so proud.
Yeah. So this really cool story of Adam Seeger, the food and beverage director at a hotel, discovering this really cool old cocktail, and wow, aren't we fortunate to have it, you know, have the cocktail for our own enjoyment today. And it's made with an ounce of bourbon, and we're using Buffalo Trace today. Half an ounce of Cointreau. Of course, we're using the Ferran dry Curacao. 7 dashes of Angostura bitters. I think that's like the second most amount of Angostura bitters, next to what, the Trinidad Sour or something like that. A lot of bitters. 7 dashes of Peychaud's bitters, and 5 ounces of champagne. Now, I've been to the Seelbach but once. I wasn't terribly impressed with the bar. The Seelbach that I was served, it had lukewarm, I won't even call it champagne, and it was generic triple sec, so it wasn't that great a drink, but I've made this drink at home, and it's actually a pretty good drink. So the way we're making it for you today, 2 ounces of Buffalo Trace bourbon, half an ounce of Ferran dry Curacao, 7 dashes each of Angostura and Peychaud's, and 5 ounces of sparkling wine or champagne. Delicious drink. Great backstory, right? Great story of digging into the old archives. We take our hats off to Adam. Wait. So this is a great photo from Ted Haigh's book, you know, incorporating some beautiful old barware and glassware and an old bottle, a bottle of Old Forester, a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, probably a 100-year-old bottle of Peychaud's bitters, and just great old stuff. Uh-oh. Fake news, what is this? The failing New York Times breaks the story that historic cocktail. Is the Washington Post still here? Yes. Turns out it's fake. Try Hillary Clinton had child labor making this drink in the basement of a Northwest Washington pizza parlor right near my house. For the last 20 years, if you were in the bar business and knew one thing about bartender Adam Seeger, was that he was the man behind the Seelbach cocktail. The Seelbach is named for the Seelbach Hotel, a storied century-old lodging in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, that is mentioned briefly in The Great Gatsby. Shortly after being put in charge of the hotel's bar and restaurant operations in 1995, Mr. Seeger declared that he had discovered a recipe, blah, 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 blah. The news media soon picked up the tale. Blah, blah, blah. After 2 decades of yarn spinning, Mr. Seeger, 47, who left the hotel in 2001 and recently helped to open the Tuck Room in downtown Manhattan, has decided to come clean that he concocted not only the drink, but the story behind it. So, yes. How's your drink, everybody? So when I read this, and this story was written by my friend Robert Simonson, who was doing a seminar later this week, I think, on myth busting.
Saturday, yeah.
Saturday, okay. Probably competing with my seminar on trademark disputes, and I'm furiously
It is, because I wanted to see both of them.
well, they're videoing it, I hope. When I first read this, I was annoyed, and then I had to chuckle, because you realize this is not, I mean, this is great fun. You know, this is important stuff that we're doing, you know. We like to pat ourselves on the back, but this is not, we're not curing AIDS. We're not, you know, this is entertainment in a lot of respects, and we work hard to get things right. And when we find out that
Phil, you said those words again.
it's not work. It's not work. It's an avocation. But when we find someone's put something out there for entertainment or for publicity or for, you know, PR, you know, more power to them. And we're just in a fun business. So anyway, that's the story of the Seelbach.
And the saving grace is it's a good drink.
Yeah.
The irony of Ted making it with 100-year-old ingredients so he could make it properly, though, just never ceases to make me smile.
So Adam confesses, I was nobody, Mr. Seeger said of his standing as a bartender then. I had no previous accolades in the bar world. I knew I could make a great drink. I wanted it to be a promotion for the hotel. I felt the hotel needed a signature cocktail. How could you have a place that F. Scott Fitzgerald hung out that doesn't have a damn cocktail? Mr. Seeger's sin is hardly an original one. Bartenders have been telling self-aggrandizing tales since there have been bars to tend. That's true. It is, however, an unusual instance of old-school leisure domain in an era when mixologists have made an effort to be more scrupulous about cocktail history. So many of the great cocktail stories were churned out by the Bacardi PR team, for example, and you know, it just becomes part of the landscape. The Seelbach cocktail story began when Mr. Seeger started digging into the hotel's history. We found old menus. I was convinced there had to be a Seelbach cocktail. You know, Chris McMillan and I have done seminars on, for example, the Roosevelt Hotel here in New Orleans, the Monteleone, and we've found old menus. We found the 1934 menu that has that has the original Vieux Carre. It always irks me when people say the Vieux Carre was invented in 1938 by Walter Bergeron. It was 1934. Come on. You know, you take your hat off to this sort of PR effort, and you know, it's not the end of the world. Then he came up with an elaborate origin story involving a couple from New Orleans who had honeymooned at the hotel in 1912. The man ordered a Manhattan, the woman a champagne cocktail. The clumsy bartender, spilling the bubbly into the Manhattan, set the mess aside to make the drinks anew. That's sort of like the story of the Negroni Spagliato. So many of these cocktail stories begin with the sidecar was invented because the bartender was trying to make, a brandy cruster or something, who knows, and he was upset because his sidecar had been damaged earlier that day. Or the stories have something to do with, oh my God, we have all this goddamn ginger beer and vodka. Who has ever heard of vodka? And we have these brass copper mugs. Let's invent the Moscow Mule, you know, or the Hurricane down the street, you know. What are we going to do with all this rum that we had to buy during World War II because whiskey is scarce? We have all this fruit at the markets, and let's invent a hurricane cocktail. You know, it's always that sort of idea of what do we do with all this surplus ingredients, or oops, I made a mistake. Hey, it doesn't taste too bad. Anyway, we're gonna leave about 20 minutes here for Q&A, but I want to thank again Sazerac Company, Peychaud's Aperitivo, Peychaud's Bitters, and Buffalo Trace Bourbon in this excellent Seelbach. I want to thank Dolan, House Alpens, importers of Dolan Rouge and Dolan Dry Vermouth, and of course our friends from Pierre Ferrand, the Plantation Old Fashioned, what is TD?
Oh, OFTD, I can't tell you that story and with the cameras going, but we'll ask Alexander or Guillaume or any of these gentlemen for the real story about that.
Old Dirty Bastard, is that it? No.
My lips are sealed.
And the Ferrand Dry Curacao, thank you to our sponsors. Cheers.
So, before we throw this open to the Q&A, I just wanted to give you one cautionary tale. How many of you out there actually come up with your own recipes? How many of you come up with drinks? All right, nice, excellent. Well, for future Phil Greenes and future bums 50, 60 years from now, and we're trying to find your recipes, do us all a favor and pay attention to this little quote from, it's a story about a restaurant called Dunbar's, late of New Orleans, no longer here. Phil can fill us in on that afterwards, but there's a story of an old, I'm reading from the book about Dunbar's, there's a story of an old Creole lady who confided her favorite recipe to her loyal family servant. With great ceremony and solemnity, she first extracted an oath of utter undying secrecy, that she sware never to repeat the recipe to a living soul. The old lady's memory failed, and she had to ask her servant for the recipe. No, ma'am, was her answer. You made me promise not to tell a living soul. Jimmy Plauchet, the owner of Dunbar's, encountered this very problem when he took over the restaurant. Mrs. Dunbar's daughter, Catherine, handed him the book of family recipes, but he discovered that there was one missing, the recipe for the crystallized grapefruit rind that was so popular with after-dinner coffee. Oh, Papa made that, Catherine told him, and he never would tell anyone how to make it. So, write it down. Write it down so that future generations can see how brilliant you were. And without Q&A, yeah.
Well, and that reminds me of another local story. The creator of the Ramos Gin Fizz, Henry Carlos Ramos, he went by Henry Charles Ramos, who went by Carl. He closed down his saloon. A lot of New Orleans bartenders stayed open during Prohibition, famously. But he was a gentleman, and he closed down his saloon. And along about 1928, I think, he realized, look, I'm not going to outlive Prohibition. I'm an old man, and I want my recipe for the Ramos Gin Fizz, which had been kept secret prior to that. And it's been published in the newspaper. You can find it in the 1928 newspaper. So he had that same idea in mind. I'm not going to outlive Prohibition. I want the world to know how to make a Ramos Gin Fizz if and when Prohibition ever ends. So, yeah, I mean, my grandmother took to the grave so many great recipes, and we'll never know how she made her spoon bread or her omelets or her fried chicken. But anyway, you must have some questions. I hope you do. Any questions out there? We should have planted a few people. Yes.
For the tiki cocktails, can you explain further on the ingredients of the rums that they were using back in the day?
Yes, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because in reconstructing a lost recipe that you happen to find, you're only ever going to be able to approximate it if it's a good recipe. Because if it's a good recipe, they're going to have called out the base spirit. They're not just going to say 2 ounces of rum. They're going to say 2 ounces of plantation OFTD, or they're going to say 2 ounces plantation OFTD, 1/2 ounce plantation 3-star. I'm talking about the contemporary version. Now, you look at old tiki recipes that you find in these notebooks that Dick Santiago or that Hank Riddle had. They were vague about what these syrup code recipes were, but even more frustrating than that, in a way, was that they called out exactly what rums went in. They were very specific. One of the things that was kind of Don the Beachcomber's genius, I think, that made him the best, really the most talented, bless you, mixologist of the 20th century, was this thing that he did that nobody else before him did, at least not in the written record. Even if you go back to Jerry Thomas in 1862 with the first book, nobody was doing what he did with the base spirit, which was to take rums of different body, character, flavor, origin, and mix them together to create a base spirit that no one bottle could give you on its own. He's alleged to have said, I never saw it in print, somebody must have just put it on the internet, what one bottle can't give you, 3 rums can. But that's essentially what he was doing. And it wasn't random. It wasn't just, oh, throw this in, throw that in, blah, blah, blah. I mean, he would spend weeks like a mad scientist, according to one of his cronies who I interviewed. He said he would sit at the bar with his friends for weeks, and they would pour cases of rum down the drain, just trying to find that right mixture of base spirit. For example, a drink called, like the Navy Grog. It's a really good example of what he did. He would take, most people would make this drink, which is like lime, grapefruit, honey, a little bit of allspice, and rum. They would just take, rum, okay, let's put a dark Jamaican rum in there. Well, that's fine, but what he did is he took the dark Jamaican rum is his base, very heavy, molassesy, very sweet, a lot of, esters in it, so it had a really, nice woody thing. And he said, well, let's cut that with a white Cuban rum, which is more floral, dry. The two rums are going to inform each other. They're going to be more interesting than either one of them on their own. And then he threw the drink another curveball, and he threw in, this is equal parts of each rum, by the way. He threw in, it's a 3-ounce base. He threw in a Demerara rum, which is a sort of a smoky, charred wood rum from Guyana, which is very distinct and entirely different flavor profile from the other two rums. The three rums together gave you this really, really rich, layered, complex base spirit. So, to answer your question, it's very important to try and approximate what they were doing, because you're never going to get that complexity. You're never going to get what the true flavor of the drink was unless you can do that. And it's, in a lot of ways, you cannot do that now. I was very fortunate to make the acquaintance, again, the same thing, shoe leather. Ted Haigh introduced me to a guy named Stephen Remsburg, who has the world's largest private vintage rum collection. He lives not far from here on Rocheblauf Avenue. I won't give you the exact address, because... And back in 2005, the first time I came to Tell's, I was invited to his house, and he started serving me. He's a true bon vivant. He's not just a collector. If he finds more than one bottle of a particular expression, he'll open it up and he'll pour it for you. So I got to try some of the rums. He's also a tiki freak, so he went to Don the Beachcombers in the 60s and 70s, and he had these drinks. So he made it a point to try and collect some of the rums that were used, that he saw behind the bar. And, back then, proof was a big factor. When you say 1 ounce of Demerara rum in a drink now, that's going to be 80 proof generally. That's going to be a lot of water in the bottle. It's 40% alcohol. So what Don and his ilk did was they routinely used overproof rums. And by overproof, it might have just been 86 proof, might have been 89 proof, 91.4 proof was something I've seen in some of these booklets. And of course the venerable 151. But you'd be surprised how detailed they called out the rums. I've seen so many recipes that call for 91.4 proof Hudson Bay Demerara rum. They put that down for a reason. Drink's not going to taste as good if it has anything else in it at any other ABV. So that's a real challenge for reconstructing these recipes.
Another example is the Ian Fleming James Bond Vesper. That's a perfect example of a drink that takes some effort to recreate it today. Calls for Gordon's Gin. Well, back in the day, Gordon's Gin was 94.4 proof. Now it's 80 proof. There's a lot of distilled water added to it. It's not the same flavor profile. So people will say to you, use Tanqueray. Tanqueray is more or less what Gordon's used to be. Okay, what about Quina Lillet? Well, it's not called Quina Lillet anymore, it's called Lillet Blanc. And you can have a big argument with the company about, is it the same thing? Is it New Coke versus Coke Classic? Or, is there less quinine? I've seen people who add a little bit of quinine powder to their Lillet Blanc to up the quinine profile. So you can have the exact recipe and still not be able to make it unless you have, the Cuba Libre, was there cocaine in the original Coca-Cola? Let's have some pre-Castro Bacardi, to make the Cuba Libre, It can drive you to drink, really. So, other questions? Yes?
What's next for you guys? Are you hunting next in cocktails? Are you close to anything?
What's next?
What's next? Or what are you looking for next?
In terms of, what do you?
And what's your discoveries? What you're looking for?
Oh, I have an October 2nd deadline to write the Paris book, and I'm finding stuff, and I won't use the W word, but you put enough hooks over the side of the boat, and you're going to catch some fish, and Paris in the 1920s was such a memorable era. There's so many memoirs of people you've never heard of and people you have heard of. A Movable Feast by Hemingway is probably the most well-known. Actually, we're going to have a party tonight at our bathtub, and we're going to make those martinis. But
I'm not going to wear a bra.
No,
Just
it's
fair warning.
So it is kind of exciting when you dig into what you're going to find. I found Okay, it's believed that the mimosa was invented at the Ritz circa 1922, something like that. And I found in Harry Crosby's memoirs, he keeps talking about champagne orangeade, and I'm like, is that the mimosa? Because he's drinking it at the Ritz. And then I find Frank Meyer's 1936 published The Artistry of Mixed Drinks, and he refers to it as orange champagne, also known as the mimosa. So it's, it's one of those moments where you're like, aha, I've connected the dots. So what's next? I don't know, but it's kind of cool to think about. Do you have anything you're working on, or?
Well, I'm a one-trick pony. My interests are very narrow. If it's a tropical drink, I'm interested in it. And for me, at this point, after all these years, it's come down to certain very elusive recipes I still don't have the recipes for. I have menus in my collection from Don the Beast Crummer in Hawaii in the 40s. He had a drink called the Cannibal Grog. He had another one called the Cherry Blossom. There's like 3 or 4 other names, and then I'd really like to know what's in those. And Joe Shalom, as I mentioned, he had about 200 recipes in his lifetime. I don't even know the names of most of them. I mean, I've only found 30. But he had a drink which he claimed was the most powerful drink he ever created for the Havana Hilton in '58. And it was called the Rocio de Gallo. And all I know is that it had 151 proof rum and I believe cassis in it. So I'd like to know what's in that. So it's a very narrow cast at this point.
Yes.
Just dovetailing on that, I forgive my ignorance if somebody already has, but is somebody writing a Joe Shalom book? Because that sounds like
It's been done. It's called Potions of the Caribbean by Jeff Beast Brumberry. Available. No, I've got the $10 for you after the. Thank you for remembering. One of the things that I was not going to write another book after 2009 when I did this book called Remix, and then I found Colette. And Colette and Joe's story really is the reason why I wrote Potions of the Caribbean. It's called 500 Years, the subtitle is 500 Years of Caribbean Drinks and the People Who Made Them. To be really honest with you guys, I know there's cameras, so I can't deny it later, I didn't really care about 450 of those years. The only time, the only chapter I really wanted to write was the Joe Shalom chapter.
What can you say about Arak,
Yeah, so chapter 6 of that book is entirely his life story, and it's Colette. When Colette started telling me these things and all the stuff she gave me from her dad's personal archives, it was like, oh my God, and that's why I wrote that book. So, thank you for asking.
Yes.
So, as a tiki purveyor, right? Like we're in the industry. Like I'm a bartender, and you've made an entire life and a career and an education about uncovering recipes and things. But as a tiki bartender, that's the one question you can't ever answer when someone's like, "Well, what rum are you using?" I'm like, "I can't tell you. You know that. Stop asking me." But the beauty of that secrecy, gets less and less important as we get in the age of cloud, because eventually it's all just there, right? Like all the recipes I've ever used are on a document, and if I passed away or something, they're just there. So how do you find the fine line? Do you think there's a way to still preserve the secrecy? And like at Latitude, is that a thing that you guys, are there still things that like no one is allowed to photograph or talk about, or like what,
Yeah, what's in Bump Mix number 3?
That's a 90-minute seminar for next thing. But no, you opened up Pandora's box, and I'm really glad you did, because I've only been a saloon keeper for a little under 3 years, and the disconnect between somebody who wants to find out what's in all these lost recipes and someone who's serving recipes and doesn't want anybody else to rip them off is a really interesting disconnect. And I find people calling up all the time saying, we want to print this recipe from your bar in our newspaper or on our website. And it's like, and I find myself in the position of all those people who frustrated me for so many years by not revealing their recipes. I haven't gotten to the point where I'm giving them fake ones yet. But it really is, now, I know we're short of time, but it's such a multi-layered question. Before the internet, if the Kansas City Star or the Washington Post or Academics wrote an article about tiki and wanted your recipe, it would have been, Academics would have been a zine in San Francisco. That only would have been seen in San Francisco. Washington Post would have been seen for one day by people in Washington, D.C., and then it would have been fish wrap, you know, lining a birdcage. No offense, but that's the way it was, you know. And that's that. So that recipe is like, nobody's going to know, really. And across the country, if somebody wanted to serve that drink and make money off it in L.A., unless they happen to be in Washington, D.C. that morning on a train reading the paper, that's it. Nothing is in the cloud. Nothing is on the internet. It's a whole different ballgame now. If the Kansas City Star writes an article about Latitude 29, or if Paul Sempt in his little blog from Atlanta writes about Latitude 29, and somebody searches the recipe that I give them, the entire world has it for they're to use lawyer term, in perpetuity throughout the universe. You can access that drink. And you can do all kinds of things depending on how scrupulous you are. You can serve it in your bar and say it's your drink. You can serve it in your bar and say it's our drink, and then get customers because we might have a reputation. And you can also, by doing so, get more media attention for your bar. The main thing, what I'm finding interesting now, to go off on a little tangent, is we're not competing for market share, tiki bartenders, the way they did in the 20th century. Competing for market share in the 20th century was, I don't want my customers to go to your bar on the other side of town. Or I don't want this bar on the other side of the country to have my recipes because then it makes my recipes less valuable. What it is now is, I don't want Smuggler's Cove to get more media attention than I get. Because now, it's not regional, it's not city by city, it's international. If somebody's blog that gets a lot of hits writes about Smuggler's Cove serving a Nui Nui, I get pissed off because I'm serving a Nui Nui and I want market share by having more media coverage because I want people who are coming to New Orleans to go on the internet and see more articles about me when they type in tiki than about Smuggler's Cove. By the way, Martin's a good friend of mine, and Smuggler's Cove is an awesome bar, but it is what it is. That's the reality now. The market share more than anything else now is virtual. And it matters. You might think it doesn't matter, but it does matter because that's what brings people in. Yes?
Yeah, quick one. Not enjoying this, is not a question per se, but about 35 years ago I acquired a Japanese cocktail book in English from a hotel in Japan. And the martini recipe, which was fairly standard, the instructions at the bottom were translated, were shaped like a tiger.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I'm going to put that in my next book. Yes?
I was kind of thinking about the Don Homer spice whole thing. You said that they went out to a company and had it produced. Did you go down that avenue to try to find the actual recipes of the number 2 and number 4?
Well, yeah, the company was long gone. The company dissolved in 1968 when John Lancaster died of cancer, is what I found out. No. I mean, they might, but here's the thing. It might be out there, dude. Go check it out. Put on those rubber-soled shoes, and it could very well be out there. That's the beauty of it, you know.
If I can really quickly plug my seminar on Saturday at I think 3:30 on intellectual property, trademarks, copyright, trade secrets, because a lot of what we're talking about today is very relevant in the bartending world, and so we'll have a couple, myself and another attorney up on the dais, and we're talking about patenting barware, things like that. So come out to that one. It'll be right next door, I think 3:30 on Saturday. I think we have time for one last question. Yes, sir.
It seems to me, when I hear, by the way, wonderful, very, very, very fascinating, but it seems to me that for spirit making, which, you know, we do the same about researching the way they were made, that in the old days, it was about secrecy and you were making your money by keeping it secret. And it seems that now it's not for spirits. It's no longer this. Master blenders in cognac might be the last corner, but that might change. And it seems to me that the answer to this is actually creativity, where it's really to stay on top of the game. You just are forced, or if you enjoy it, it's even better, coming up with things that are just mind-blowing one after the other. It seems to me that keeping to yourself is replaced by being super creative to attract and pay attention. Do you see this?
Yes, if I had opened Latitude 29 in 2009, before Smugglers, before Three Dots and a Dash, before Lost Lake, before all these New Lounge in Bologna, before all these other amazing world-class tiki bars opened up, they were serving the classic canon that I resurrected in my books, not to toot my own conch shell, but they were serving the Zombie, the Nui Nui, all the Trader Vic drinks, all the classics. And if I had opened my bar in 2009, my entire menu of 36 drinks would be Don the Beachcomber drinks, because I love them. They're amazing, and you can't do better than Don. But opening in 2014, I did exactly what you're talking about. I had to reach into myself and be creative and say, look, everybody else is doing that now. You can go to all the major cities in the world and get these drinks in really well-run, excellent tiki bars.
Thanks to you.
So now, over half my menu is original drinks that I came up with, inspired by the classics, to set my bar apart from all these other bars. And you can only get these drinks in my bar because we invented them. You know, me or my team. I've got a great crew now, and we're workshopping things, but my first menu was like stuff I just came up with. But you're absolutely correct. I only agree with open sourcing up to a point, though. Now that I'm a business owner, there's that old joke, Democrats are Republican. I mean, a Republican is a Democrat who's been mugged. And I think somebody who's into open source, until you open your own bar, you might change your tune a little bit about open. Jim Meehan's very big on open sourcing, for example. But that doesn't always work in business. And I've only been in one for 2.5 years, but that's what I'm finding out. But the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. The fact that everybody was serving all the classics pushed me to make a menu of very distinct drinks that give us our own signature. So yes.
I'm remiss in not thanking, we thank the sponsors. I want to thank the Caps back there. Thank you so much. Leah, great work, Leah. AK, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.